John Cameron Swayze.
Chet Huntley. David Brinkley. John Chancellor.
Tom Brokaw.
Coretta Scott King. Tonight, the life and death of the First Lady of the American Civil Rights Movement. By her husband's side and later on her own, a woman who helped change the world. Sworn in, Judge Samuel Alito wins Senate confirmation and is now a U.S. Supreme Court justice. Tonight, how will he change the court? State of the Union, the big-ticket items in the president's speech, healthcare, Iraq, and what he calls America's addiction to oil. And side by side, a veteran of the Iraq War and her closest comrade in combat, saying thanks for letting them stay together on the home front.
This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, reporting tonight from Washington.
Good evening. Behind us here tonight before a joint session of Congress and a live television audience across the country, President George W. Bush will report to the nation on the State of the Union and lay out his plan for the future. Under that very same Capitol dome earlier today, the Bush administration was handed a major victory of this president's second term when Judge Samuel Alito was confirmed as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. But we begin here tonight with an icon of the past several decades in this country, a woman who became a towering moral force and a symbol of the civil rights movement after the assassination of her husband. Coretta Scott King died today. She was 78 years old. She outlived her husband by 38 years, and in doing so became a major force in her own right. Coretta Scott King had been in failing health since suffering a stroke and a heart attack last August.
She managed a graceful and beautiful passing.
Mrs. King died at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico. In a statement tonight, members of her family said she had ovarian cancer and that doctors in this country considered her condition terminal. She was in Mexico to consider possible alternative treatment. As we mentioned at the top of the broadcast, we are here in Washington covering two other big stories tonight: the President's State of the Union address and the swearing in of the Supreme Court's 110th Justice Samuel Alito. We have coverage of both stories here tonight, beginning with our NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, good evening.
Brian, good evening to you. The biggest period of turnover on the Supreme Court in more than a decade is over now, but the change in the court's direction is just beginning. The intense debate over Samuel Alito kept going right up to the very last. As a justice, he'll wear it tonight to join three of his colleagues in attending the State of the Union speech, Brian.
Pete, then when will Justice Alito and his 8 fellow justices on the court get down to the business of actually hearing cases next?
Well, that'll happen when the court's winter...
Thanks for that, Pete. Our Justice correspondent, Pete Williams, outside the Supreme Court building not far from here tonight. And now to what will transpire right behind us here this evening, the State of the Union address. And already tonight, the White House has previewed some of the themes we will hear from the president. NBC News Chief White House correspondent David Gregory is with us with more on that tonight. David, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Aides say the president knows he is addressing an anxious, even disgruntled nation tonight. With growing concerns about the war in Iraq, the president will warn against isolationism and pessimism, even as he tries to breathe new life into his domestic agenda this election year. The president in the Oval Office today, a spirited defense from the president on this warrantless surveillance program that he ordered, a tactic he considers central to saving American lives in the war on terror. Brian?
Thanks, David. We'll see you later for the speech. David Gregory tonight at the White House. There is an awful story tonight out of the picturesque town of Goleta, California, just outside Santa Barbara. A former postal worker, a woman who had been put on medical leave for psychological problems, shot and killed 5 people at her old workplace before killing herself. This is the worst case of violence at a postal facility since back in 1986 when a mailman killed 14 people in Oklahoma. Police have not released the killer's name in this case and won't speculate on a motive. There is news of a guilty plea tonight in the case of that awful nightclub fire in Rhode Island almost 2 years ago now. You may remember the pictures and descriptions from that night. Pyrotechnics that were part of a performance by the band Great White ignited some soundproofing foam. The flames then engulfed the club in just minutes. 100 people were killed that night. Now the band manager who set off the fireworks has agreed to plead guilty to 100 counts of involuntary manslaughter and serve up to 10 years in prison. We have an update tonight on what was our lead story here last night. ABC World News Tonight co-anchor Bob Woodruff and veteran ABC cameraman Doug Vogt, both wounded after a roadside bomb exploded during a patrol in Iraq. Today at Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland, just outside Washington, the two men were among over 24 wounded to be brought home. The rest were members of the U.S. Armed Forces. It's a reminder this is a scene that plays out constantly, but normally takes place well outside the view of cameras. One of the men's doctors said Vogt is doing well and that he joked he wanted to go to Paris instead of going to Bethesda. The doctor said Woodruff is showing increasing signs of consciousness after his head injury, moving his arms and legs and opening his eyes. When NBC Nightly News continues this Tuesday night from Capitol Hill in Washington, NBC News In Depth, a topic we will hear about from the president tonight, this nation's health care crisis. Tonight we'll go to the front lines, why the long and awful wait for emergency care. And later, why it took an act of Congress to reunite a decorated Iraq War veteran with her closest companion. NBC News In Depth tonight, we take a look at this nation's health care emergency. As we reported, we will hear more about this issue from the president tonight. 45 million Americans are uninsured, and tonight we have new numbers proving again that Americans have deep concerns about health care. In our latest NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, when asked about everyday expenses, nearly half said the government should make health care costs the top priority. They ranked it more importantly than they do gas prices, education, or heating their own homes. NBC News chief science correspondent Robert Bazell has our report tonight from one hospital that is really feeling the impact.
Therefore, patient will be intubated.
Harborview, Seattle's county hospital, illustrates many of the problems facing America's healthcare system.
We're going to have to go to recess 1 right now. I'd rather put him in 2, but I can't.
The emergency room.
Up next here tonight, a look back at the career of the man who's been called the maestro. He has moved the markets and left his mark on American pop culture. Tonight, he's saying goodbye to a life in the public eye. Opening statements got underway today in the long-awaited trial of the two former top executives of Enron, the energy giant that imploded in the biggest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history. That was back in 2001. Ken Lay and Jeffrey Skilling are charged with fraud and conspiracy. They could face prison for the rest of their lives if they're convicted in this case. Prosecutors said the company was a ticking time bomb in its last months and that Lay and Skilling covered that up. Skilling's lawyer said there was no fraud involved in the Enron collapse, saying the company fell victim to an unanticipated cash crisis. The Federal Reserve Board raised a key interest rate again today. The Fed funds rate was boosted a 0.25 percentage point to 4.5%, which puts borrowing costs at their highest level now in nearly 5 years. Reaction on Wall Street was mildly negative. The Dow lost 35 points today. NASDAQ was down less than 1 point. And another word here about the Fed. When it met today, it wasn't just another meeting. It was Alan Greenspan's last meeting as chairman. He retired today. Now his replacement, Ben Bernanke, takes over. Perhaps you've heard the expression, tough act to follow. Our report on the Greenspan legacy tonight from our chief financial correspondent, Ann Thompson.
In 18 years at the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan proved to be as resilient as the economy. He served 5 presidents, 4 as Fed chairman, lowering inflation and presiding over the longest economic expansion in history, personifying the Fed. Former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin.
It's not so much that he and his work, in terms of the job chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, are one, but he and the substance of what he does and what he's involved with and engaged in, I think are really one.
Greenspan was an adept crisis manager, guiding the economy through the Dow's 508-point plunge 2 months after he took office, the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, and September 11th.
He's an easy person to be around. He just happens to be a great central banker.
So influential, he became part of the popular culture in comedy.
Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan turned 75 this week. However, talk on the street is that he's going to lower it to 74 and a half.
On canvas by Aaron Crow.
He's a master at talking, and nobody understands what he says.
Including his wife, NBC News correspondent Andrea Mitchell.
He claims that he proposed marriage 3 times before I understood what he was saying.
Yet some think he talked too much.
He talked a lot about things he didn't have any control over, like the federal budget, like tax policy.
His support of President Bush's tax cuts led the Senate's leading Democrat Harry Reid to call Greenspan one of the biggest political hacks in Washington. Sometimes knocked, one time knighted, the face of the Fed, rationally exuberant as he leaves. Ann Thompson, NBC News, New York.
When we come back here tonight, a story we've been following for some weeks now. Why it was a dog spent some time up here on Capitol Hill today.
NBC brings you Blogging Baghdad, daily journals from the war in Iraq, only at baghdadblog.msnbc.com.
Fierce rivals, bad blood. The Wings and Avalanche do get out in Denver or regional action. Saturday at 2 Eastern, the NHL is on NBC.
You may be aware of this next story we've been following. It got its start in the war in Iraq. A decorated veteran of that war wanted just one thing when she came home to the States. She wanted to be reunited with her dog, a dog that served with her over there. The idea was they were to retire back here, but then rules got in the way, at least until now. Here is NBC's Chip Reed.
In the halls of
So on an up note, that is NBC Nightly News for this Tuesday evening. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams reporting tonight from Washington. We'll see you back here tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern Time for the State of the Union Address. Good night.